unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc. I'm here today with Anastasia Berg, who is a professor of philosophy at UC Irvine, and also the co-author, along with Rachel Wiseman, of this new book. It's called What Are Children For? On Ambivalence and Choice. Welcome, Anastasia.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So this is kind of an interesting topic. Why have children? Because it's not something that I think people have given a lot of thought to over our, hundreds of thousands of years of existence. It just seemed to be, part of life that it was just assumed that everybody would, at least do their best to try to have children or do their best to engage in activities that would result in children. And it's only relatively recently that we've had to think about this consciously, right? Where it is a choice that occupies us. Now, of course, within Christianity and some other religions, there have been folks that have chosen a life of celibacy and childlessness. But, for most of our history, if you were childless, it wasn't a choice. And so I guess philosophers haven't really engaged this issue very much. I mean, Socrates, he had 3 children. I didn't even know he had 3 children. I just found that out from your book because he never mentions them and he never talks about it and it never comes up. And you can talk about what is virtue and what is justice and all this, but it's never, parenting and having and child rearing and so forth. It never pops up. So, why is it that philosophers haven't engaged this? Is it because it just was sort of part of our background of our existence?
So it's a bit more complicated than haven't engaged in. So we certainly do not see historically the kind of practical popular preoccupation with the subjective question of should I have children and the kind of big question of should humanity continue perpetuating itself. But it's not to say that this concern doesn't come up. So in fact, very early on, so as early as we have any kind of documented, at least Western philosophy, we see the question of whether or not life is so miserable and so full of evil that perhaps it's not worth perpetuating because it's actually just not worth living come up incredibly early. So we have a lost dialogue of Aristotle's being quoted in Plutarch, where we have an interlocutor say, the idea that the best thing for man is never to be born at all, and the second is to die as soon as possible is, quote, on everyone's lips. What does that mean? It means it's a common sense saying, but it wasn't a practical concern that preoccupied people.
This is the myth of Silenus, that one?
This is the myth of Silenus, exactly. So a lot of us would be familiar with it from Nietzsche, who talks about it, Birth of Tragedy. And what he's referring to is an incredibly ancient kind of myth where there's a claim to the fact that the greatest wisdom is to know this, to know that human life is so evil, is so miserable, it's not worth living. But it's not something that's preoccupying, quote unquote, ordinary people. And the way I like to frame it is to say, no one's really trying to answer this challenge. They mention it. They say it's really popular. Everyone knows this is right, but no one seems to be incredibly worried about it. And which gives us a question, which we try, among other things, to answer in the book is what is different now? I would just, as a philosophy geek, I do want to say parenthetically that the question of parenting is, in fact, quite important in ancient philosophy. So if you think about the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is precisely telling us when and how we should be raising our young in order to create virtuous citizens, maybe in contradistinction to more contemporary forms of ethics. So to the question of what's happening now, there are many answers. We tried to make our own intervention. A lot of times that question is framed as a question of how has the opportunity cost of having children shifted. So the thought is, it is now not just costlier to have children, but in fact, we're giving up more and more because of all of the wonderful opportunities that we have as modern people to pursue. Our provocation is that the transformation is, in fact, much more radical. And it's actually closer to how you are framing the question, Greg, which is to say, it's not that the opportunity cost has radically change. It's that we're approaching the question of whether or not to have children through the lens of an opportunity cost at all. And once we do, once we think of children as one possible project among many, it's not very surprising it's coming up short. It is an incredibly costly in any imaginable sense, time, energy, like mental capacities, emotionally, and of course, materially. And putting even aside the predictable cost, the risks are tremendous. You're opening yourself up to being as vulnerable as you are already in the life of another human being. And so it's not very surprising that people are gradually opting out. In fact, so much so that some people will frame the choice to have children today as an opt in. So it's something that you have to actively choose and embrace, not something that's going to just happen.
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time around economists. And so, they talk about having a kid as sometimes it's a consumer good, right? Sometimes it is an investment, right? And they'll talk about whether it is a positive or negative NPV investment. And so it seems like over time, there's been this back and forth where some people will say, having a child is a selfish act, right? That it's something which you do in order to gratify your own, I don't know, desire for permanence or to distract yourself from the misery of life. And then other people will say, no, it's actually very selfish to not have a kid, right? Because you just want to enjoy life and travel, and you don't want to have to make sacrifices. And so it's interesting because there seems to be, a flip flop where, even today you'll find people divided over, how selfish or how altruistic it is to have a child.
Yeah, that's a great point, which is why I think that perhaps asking which choice is less selfish is perhaps not the most helpful way of critically thinking through the question of why it has become so difficult for people not to choose to have children. So, just as a kind of disclaimer, the book is not a book about why you have to embrace the choice to have children. It's not going to tell you to have children. The goal of the book is to help people think in a more confident and clear way about the question. We think that has become very difficult, especially in secular, which usually means liberal and progressive circles today. So our goal is to help you think through it. And I don't think that the question of just how selfish this is, precisely for what you're saying, we can make arguments on both sides, is very helpful. We think there are a couple of things that we want to draw our attention to. The first thing is we really want to lift the burden of certain kinds of norms and paradigms, of ways of thinking of what success means, what a successful relationship means, what professional success means in your life, so that you might be able to see that some of the things that are causing a lot of anxiety about children are not necessary. And then the second part is thinking through the kind of normative, just say ethical or moral challenges that we see to having children today. And those come in two varieties, at least, which is one is a feminist challenge. So can parenthood, motherhood be reconciled with a feminist agenda, which is to say one that wants to empower women and give an opportunity to pursue their life goals on an equal footing with men? And secondly, it's that big ethical question that we see today put in the always in the guise of climate change. As I already hinted at, it's actually a very old philosophical question, but it's the question of look around you. It's human life that has brought us into this mess. Should we really have any more of it? I think once we start going through the question in this way, we're moving away from this question of selfishness, and I think we can get a little bit more clarity. And again, we've been as gratified by people telling us that it has helped overcome a certain kind of hurdle and embrace a choice to have a child, as we've been so happy to see people say it actually helped me reconcile myself to the possibility of not having biological children, because we recognize, just to preempt kind of one big claim of the book, that in having children, something bigger than the self is at stake. One thing that's at stake is how am I going to be contributing to the possibility of a flourishing human future? But guess what? Biological children are only one condition of that robust, flourishing human future. I can do so much more to contribute to it. So people have told us, I realize I can embrace my role as an uncle or aunt, a godparent, a teacher, a politician, a journalist, a thinker, and find satisfaction there.
Or professor. Don't forget that. Right.
I think, yeah, well, teachers, right.
Yeah. I just had 3 former students over for dinner last night, and, it's kind of there's a bit of a almost like a, paternal or parental, um, urge that's, satisfied in that way. But look, I think the way you start off the book confronting head on the demographic changes that we've seen. I mean, it's undeniable that, fertility, I mean, I don't know what, that's not really the right word, but, reproduction has been on the decline in the West. And it's not just that people are having fewer children, they intend to have fewer children and they want to have fewer children. That's one thing. But then they wind up having even fewer than they intend to have. And so a lot of people have been wondering what's driving this. And some people say it's economics. Other people say it's ideology or preferences. And I certainly know from my students that they feel an enormous, or at least they say they feel an enormous economic challenge to having children. They talk about, oh, children are so expensive. I can't even think about them until I have established myself. And it's all there. It's going to be like the cherry on top, And then, unfortunately, the place where they want to be might not happen until after it's no longer viable. These are economic explanations about economic insecurity and lack of resources. But there are other economists that talk about how, it's prosperity that leads to a reduction in childhood. So how can it be both, right?
Exactly. So first of all, we have these two competing narratives where under it's the economy, stupid people seem to mean both. People don't have enough money and people have too much money to have children. So that's good. You're already doing the work for me. But let's make it a little concrete by noticing that in countries where the economic hurdles, as we conceive of them, as your students probably are reporting, have been entirely lifted, the birth rates have not been affected. So countries that guarantee generous parental leave, free childcare, free healthcare, that have generally robust social welfare networks, we don't see the birth rates increase. Now, for a certain kind of critic, hearing this is sufficient and they dismiss, let's say, your students and their talk of financial and professional anxiety as either selfish or hypocritical or just delusional. That's not where we're coming from. I think that's too easy. I think what's interesting is to ask a harder question, which is, what if this is still salient to them? What if they're reporting a true difficulty? And yet we have to take seriously the fact that we have reason to think that if we actually just lifted the financial burdens, perhaps their actual choices wouldn't change. And interestingly, when we end up arguing, this is kind of a bit remarkable, Greg, you're already giving some of the answer. No one has, and I've done a lot of these, which is, there's a difference between saying something is unaffordable and saying that one feels themselves beholden to such a high and in fact indeterminate standard of what success and security would mean that one never quite feels like they've made it. And that is interestingly not just true of how people are thinking about their financial or professional lives. You can recognize a very similar pattern across other aspects of their existence. So the way people are thinking about whether or not I, as a psychological subject, am ready to have children. So again, they're holding themselves to a very high standard. And we'll see it when people saying, I'm still a kid. How can I even think about it? I haven't finished my 10 years course of therapy. And the same thing happens in the romantic relationship. So people have a conception of how a relationship has to meet a standard of maximal compatibility, security, safety before we can even contemplate the question of children. And one of the interesting dynamics that we do trace is how these kind of norms and conceptions, paradigms of success across every aspect of our existence, they not only make people make these very conscious choices about when am I going to have a child, what they do, I think, more often is actually they make it very natural to postpone thinking about it. So I call it the kind of self-evidence of a logic of postponement. When should you have kids? Not now. When should you have kids? As late as kind of humanly possible, because that's going to be safer. That's going to be more prudent than to do it now. That is, of course, then getting feeding into that is then the kind of moral and political anxieties about having children. And I think we have a perfect storm where the question of children, for all these reasons, is just getting pushed. But as we know today, to have children, it's not something that's going to happen just by walking around in the world. It's something that we have to, at least in kind of the paradigm case, open ourselves up to intentionally. And so I think a lot of what happens, in addition to kind of very intentional, voluntary childlessness, is that decision is being made for people and not by them.
Right.
And this
So
is
it's
really,
inadvertent childlessness.
I think there's a lot of inadvertent childlessness. There's also a lot, you mentioned it yourself, there's that gap between the number that people say they would want to have of children and the number they actually have. We have to take these things with a grain of salt. I heard a really great analogy to it, which is imagine people getting being surveyed as like, how many times do you want to work out in a week and how many times you actually do? And there's a gap there, but what exactly does that gap mean? So it's very easy to throw out a number, especially when you feel like throwing out that number that's higher than the number you actually have is a way of protesting things that you do not like, say, in your society and your political situation, right? You don't like that you're not living in a place that has no welfare safety net. And so you'll say, of course, I would have had more if I had it. You don't like a threat to reproductive rights. You don't like the fact that we're doing nothing sufficient about climate change. But putting that aside, I do actually think there's truth to the gap. I don't think it's just what I just described, which is kind of a way of making a kind of protest. I think what's also happening is that people are starting to have those children. A lot of times it's an afterthought. People have referred in the context of women to this kind of mid-30s into their 40s as the panic years. They do it in kind of a panic state. And then they might not have the children that they would have had if they had been in a position to ask these questions and think about it clearly a little earlier.
Well, I mean, it seems like when it comes to career, people are very thoughtful about thinking through the steps and the goals. When it comes to marriage and family, it almost seems, I don't know, people don't want to think of it in that way, right? To actually think it in a very practical way, like to plan it and schedule it and so forth, somehow detracts from the romance, detracts from the specialness, right? I mean, should people be thinking more, I don't know, pragmatically about, I mean, do you think that there's some kind of, I don't know, failure of hedonic forecasting, right? I talked about this with Agnes Callard, who you referenced in the book, which is like people don't actually know what it's like to be a parent. And so it's hard to make a plan to do something when you don't really know what it's going to be like.
It's definitely hard to make a plan for things you don't know what they'll be like. I will say that under describes the anxiety today that having children provokes, as just from this angle. So quine experience and how it affects you. I mean, my co-author in her personal essay, the book is bookended by personal essays. The middle chunky chapters are kind of critical and analytic. But she talks about facing the question of whether or not to have a child, or rather the difficulty of even raising the question as the possibility of throwing yourself off a cliff. So this isn't just, I can't really imagine what being a professor would be like. This is something that's perceived, and often also because it's painted, we could talk about what representations in our culture are contributing to this as an extreme, transformative but destructive experience. In philosophy, we've seen the rise of the transformative experience narrative, and a paradigm example of that is parenting. Now, it can sound perhaps attractive to some, but transformation, what it really means is that you are changed beyond your own recognition.
So it's
Now,
scary.
it's scary, but also to fear is one thing, but people, especially the older they are, they might like the things they care about, right? Things they care about, they hold dear, the things they've built themselves, right? So we're waiting and we're building ourselves and we're constituting ourselves as subjects in the world. We don't want to lose all that. We don't want to stop caring about all the things that we've been cultivating for years. We don't want to lose ourselves as the friends we are, as the professors we are, as the thinkers we are, as the kind of romantic partners in our relationships that we are. So the transformation is one that really threatens annihilation of self. Not just, I think it's more radical than this difficulty of doing a hedonic calculation. What you're saying about the reluctance of calculating, though, I think is really important to thematize, because we see it especially as people increasingly report a conflict between pursuing what a lot of people are able to actually articulate as like a family goal or desire to have children, and what they conceive romantic relationships to be for. And we see an incommensurability. So in a study that we talk about in the book, it was a study that was conducted with women who were considering freezing their eggs or who had frozen their eggs. And they were trying to understand their motivations through in-depth interviews, expecting to find career women trying to extend their career timelines. What they really found, however, is that the demographic that was trying to pursue this technology was not what they thought. It wasn't all girl bosses. A lot of these women were kind of working women, there were middle class women, there were nurses and social workers, there were teachers. They were putting all their money in egg freezing. That's first of all. So why were they doing it? They were doing it because they didn't want to compromise their romantic goals. Because just like you were saying, the idea of dating with a view to having children, not just the kind of temporal planning, but just dating with a view to it, felt like something that would instrumentalize the romantic bond, instrumentalize love, and cause compromise. Now, this is another radical transformation from how people understood the goal of trying to find at least a permanent partner in marriage, which was family. So I think it's not so much that So I certainly think that, as with other things in our lives, including, by the way, romantic relationships themselves, I think encouraging us collectively, culturally, to be open to the question of the worth of human life earlier, to lift a kind of taboo in especially feminist circles around talking about biology. It's coded reactionary and conservative today, but as I often say, if feminism is about empowering women and knowledge is power, we need to have this knowledge really readily available. I do want to have people thinking more critically about, as we were saying, the self-evidence of just doing it as late as possible. And the truth is that, as you know, it's almost like people don't like the idea of date night because it's contrived. Like if you're really, really busy, you have to schedule your romance, and that doesn't seem to be great. But the people who don't will say, well, but divorce is worse. So when you talk to women for whom, according to their own understanding, having children is something that they realized they wanted, and they will say, I wish somebody talked to me about reproductive facts earlier. I wish it was more normalized to bring up the question, do you want to have children earlier in kind of the romantic negotiation? Then I would say that whatever we lose, I think we'll gain a lot by normalizing that kind of conversation earlier.
Well, that the slow love strand that you reference, the desire for the perfect partner, I mean, that's very different from the explanations that are rooted in feminism, right? Which are focused primarily on, finding fulfillment and gratification in the workplace, right? As opposed to in the family. Because I think, there it's not about a story of romance. I mean, it's not a story, because that sounds very, I don't know, that sounds almost old fashioned, the idea that you want to find this perfect romantic partner.
Oh, that's a good question. I see them going hand in hand because I think that the there are many feminisms, but the kind of quote unquote feminist conception, the kind of conception of what success would mean for women, I don't think it extends just to the workplace. I think it's about And this is in itself, just so far as what I'll say now, this sounds great. It's giving women an opportunity to fulfill themselves across every parameter of their lives on an equal footing. So that means giving an opportunity to become autonomous subjects. It means giving them an opportunity to pursue relationships with the same kind of freedom, not out of some economic necessity, not out of a response to social pressure, not out of a response to the socioeconomic limitations under which they live, such that it is only with a partner that they can have a credit card. Or can like sneak in and get his books, but it also means their own intellectual and creative development, and it also means a kind of romantic, erotic, self-fulfillment. But again, in the cases we're talking about, what's really interesting, this is why the study is so interesting to us, it's not women who say they don't want to have children. They want to have children so much that they're diverting a lot of their own material resources. They're not getting a car. They're giving up their down payment for a house in order to secure the possibility of having a family of their own, and yet not letting that desire change their own scripts of what they're looking for from a romantic relationship. Now, here is something we haven't talked about, but if I may, it's very easy to talk about this question as a question that's for and about women. It's really important, we think, to, overcome that. So actually, I think the real feminist approach to the question is realize this isn't just a feminist question, this is a human question. And here there's something that I don't think we should be just putting on the shoulders of women, like they should reconsider the norms and paradigms. There's work, straightforward work, I think, that men can perform. And to explain what it is, let's just take a little step back and remind ourselves that men who have been responsive to feminists, who take themselves to want to do justice by women, who find that critique salient, there's been a bit of a swing where the common interpretation of what it means to be a good feminist ally to women is to leave all reproductive choice to them. So we kind of joke and say,
Like, whatever you say, I'll support it, right? That kind of
the
thing.
refrain is whatever you want, honey. Now, as we say, it could be frustrating to get that as a response to the question, what should we order today for food, for dinner, or what should we watch today on our streaming service? It could be really unbearable as an answer to the question, should we have children? Because I think neither men nor women would, in an ideal situation, like to have a child with somebody who's not wanting that experience, partly because of the reasons we're talking about. It's tough and scary and requires that joint commitment. So there's a challenge here. How do we articulate a kind of way of being for men to ask this question, not as an afterthought in their 50s, ask it earlier, make room in the early negotiations of a relationship to explore that together in a way that is not oppressive and restrictive of women's choices, which is what these men are hoping to avoid.
Right. So if a man was, say, dating and said, very early on in the process, listen, I want to have children, if you're not interested, like, I don't want to date you. I mean, that would be considered a bit boorish, right?
You know what? I think that if that is where he stands, it might not be pleasant to hear it on date number 3, but it's going to be very painful and very difficult and more than awkward to hear a year into a relationship. And we've heard from women who said we did not even raise this question of what we want from our lives, even though we've been discussing absolutely everything else for a whole year or more into a relationship. And at this point, if there's a mismatch, people are facing a much more difficult situation than they would be on date number 3. The economists would like to talk about sunk costs here. I'll just talk about the level of commitment, life intermingling, the codependence, not in a pathological sense, that is happening as we enter a relationship with someone. So as far as I can see, I take that boorishness. I think we should, again, maybe lift that kind of normative judgment there and welcome making room for that conversation. And I think the fact that we perceive it as like, better keep it to yourself, I think that does an unkindness and an injustice to women, by telling men, well, you don't want to have kids in the next 10 or 20 or years or ever, but keep it to yourself. Let her spend a year with you before you actually open up about it. That doesn't that seem to be doing a kindness to women.
Now, in the book, you provide a very concise history of feminism's relationship to motherhood. And it seems like there is a bit of back and forth, right? Where one strand of feminism argued that it was important to divorce the notion of woman from motherhood, so much so that some of them advocated for, I guess, kibbutz style communal raising of children, and maybe even, trying to figure out how men could get pregnant, even, or whatever, that sort of
Artificial
thing.
wombs.
Yeah. And then there's another strain which says, no, 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 like that is what makes women special. And this is something that women need to own and to, really lean into. And it seems like that back and forth has settled in one direction. And now the only people who are emphasizing the uniqueness of women as mothers are people who are conservative, right? So how did that debate ultimately fall on one side?
Yeah. So very importantly, it's, I think, very helpful to know that it used to be a kind of an intra feminist debate. There was a real open question of what do we do with motherhood? Um, and what we see exactly like you described, that after the kind of call it the mummy wars had settled, what we had is a kind of stalemate. The only thing that the parties could agree on is the fact that every woman should just be allowed to choose for herself. Um, and through kind of a complicated transformation, we now have, and a lot of it because of that, the only way people who are willing to talk about the value of parenthood being conservatives who, just as you said, usually talk about the value of motherhood. Now, as I kind of hinted at before, I think that both parties to this debate at least share one assumption that I think we should try and overcome, which is that assumption that this is a women's issue. So the question of the value of human life and the role of children in our lives is a question about motherhood, but that's a question about parenthood. Certainly, for the people who are reading this book, which we're just going to assume most of them are aspiring to some kind of equitable arrangement in parenthood, whether or not they're becoming parents themselves. The question of whether or not motherhood is an avenue for self-fulfillment should give way to the question of whether or not parenthood is something of value in human life and how to reconcile it with other demands, moral, material, etc. So, and as we said, that's true of both the individual level, so within a relationship, to trying to overcome the thought that the liberal left thing to do is to put the burden of not just choice, but the burden of asking this question of deliberation, of assuming responsibility for the choice squarely on the shoulders of women, and also socially to try and find a way of both recognizing the unique burdens that parenthood places on women, especially in the early stages of parenthood, but also reminding us that this is a profound human question. And for all those inequalities of raising children, if we look at it through in the long run, if we look at what it is to raise a child into adulthood, there are plenty of opportunities to equal out that parenting playing field.
Now, look, there's a lot of folks who will claim to take a philosophical position, right? So forgetting about the financial pressures and the difficulty of finding a partner and so forth. There are people who will say, no, I just don't want to have children. And some of them will say, who would want to bring a child into this terrible world? They're going to suffer global warming and so forth. But I mean, you point out that, our world isn't nearly as bad as the world of our ancestors. So, I mean, it's sort of saying that they were all terrible people for having children, right? I mean, while climate change is new, suffering is not new. It's been around for a while. So, I mean, to what extent are these folks unaware of the fact that they are articulating an argument that is, older than the hills?
Yeah, so there's definitely some unawareness. It's interesting. The position we kind of take in the book is that I think for people who raise these concerns, there's a tendency of a certain kind of, I think somebody referred to it once like a debate bro who likes to throw facts back. So you can throw facts back and explain to people that, in fact, even under particularly unhappy predictions of what happens to the climate if we don't do enough, that world in terms of welfare, not just on average, but globally and across all sectors, that world is still one in which well-being for human beings is higher. But here's what's interesting. This is probably not going to change the way people feel about the question. This suggests to us, and people are welcome to try. Take somebody who talks about the climate and say, but actually the world is better. This is not going to move them. And this suggests that what they're doing in raising that concern isn't trying to raise a kind of empirical claim about a declining world. At this point, like we were talking before, you can just dismiss them as talking bad faith, or they're ignorant, they're giving excuses, they just want to go on vacation and they're giving this moral excuse. I don't think that's all that's happening. I think, in fact, at least for a lot of these people, what we can detect is a kind of expression of anxiety and security and like a loss of faith in the very project of what it is that we're doing. We could say, I don't think it's any less than in the human form of life. And climate change gives us a very concrete, it's like an objective correlative of that, what we can call like a profound philosophical anxiety, an ethical anxiety about both what is the position of a parent vis-a-vis a child who's going to inevitably face suffering, failure, grief. And moreover, we're not just suffering creatures, suffering from natural causes, and the fact that we're finite and going to die. We suffer because we are selfish. We're rapacious. We've created the world that is a source of this suffering. So I think the first step is to realize that something profound is at stake, and one that is so profound that I think these kind of empirical retorts are not going to move. So what can we do? Well, we need to do something that we can call philosophical therapy. We need to show why these arguments, take them really seriously, and then show what might be the problem of these arguments. So insofar as suffering is concerned, I think the interesting perspective is to take on it is not just temporal, but let's take the assumption of the argument seriously. There's some intuitive sense where it seems like it makes sense that the more likely your child is to suffer, perhaps you're less morally justified. You're kind of in moral peril as you're choosing to bring him into the world. Now, the first thing to show is let's see what the consequences of that position are. Well, one of them is that people are more justified to have children the more they can guarantee their well-being. Who can guarantee the well-being of their children? People of a higher socioeconomic status.
So it's like a new eugenicism in a way.
It's a new eugenicism. And as we say, people can buy a lot of things with money, but the moral right to have children doesn't seem like it should be one of them. And if that still seems appealing, I always invite people who I'm talking to kind of imagine maybe a kind of a place in the world right now where all our eyes are on it, and we're deeply concerned about the kind of catastrophic suffering of the people who are living in those kind of circumstances. So think of, to be very dark humored, your favorite war zone, and imagine going to the people there and telling them you're less morally justified to have children because your children are going to suffer probably more than mine. And if that strikes you as abhorrent, as repulsive, as perverse, let's stick with that moral intuition and let it do the work of freeing us, or kind of making us maybe worry about that original assumption. But how can we overcome the assumption? A repugnant reductio doesn't show us how we can get out of the conundrum. Well, one of the things to notice is that this entire frame is based on another assumption, and it's this: what you're responsible for as a parent is the well-being of your child, the overall well-being of your child, as if in addition to all the actual things that will bring your child happiness and despair, so natural causes, human causes, structural causes, there you are, the parent, allocating suffering, and everything is on you. I like to remind people that when children, or we ourselves, we fall in love or something nice happens, no one goes to their parents and is like, thanks for that. mom and pop. Um, and we want to reframe that. So, and this is also there's going to be more future work on this, but what I think people are responsible for in being parents is not that overall well-being. What they're responsible for is preparing to the best of their abilities their children for meeting life's challenges, pains, and suffering. So it's not to say that you can't fail as a parent. It's not to say that we can't say that some people like, should you be a parent? I'm not sure. But it is to say that that judgment is not going to be based on the likelihood of your child to just encounter suffering of any kind.
But I mean, is part of this due to the rise of intensive parenting? I mean, where people feel an enormous amount of pressure they feel an enormous responsibility. Like if I screw up, then my kid is going to have a terrible life, and so I don't want to, I don't want to do it unless I can do it really well. And so it's
Yeah.
kind of a perfectionism. You talk about perfectionism in romance and, perfectionism in work. I mean, is there sort of a perfectionism in parenting now that makes it more intimidating?
So I think that's a great question, but I think, and I think it's one that's really tempting in the context of American parenting. But if we step back and look at it globally, it's hard to sustain. Now, of course, it could be that completely different things are driving um, the choices in different countries. But if we look at Northern European countries, they're not just famous for their social welfare system, they're also famous for being very laid back parents.
Yeah,
And they're
leave the
also,
stroller outside the restaurant and all that
they
kind of
leave
stuff.
the strollers at the restaurant, the kids go home by themselves, they ride the bus, the toys are whatever's in the kitchen. So, and the birth rates are the same. And in fact, it's not just that the parenting isn't intensive, it's also um, the kind of anxiety about their kids' success looks very different. So no one in a country like that is worrying about their kids getting into an Ivy League school. They're kind of letting, so there isn't also just not even in terms of the time investment, but also in terms of the emotional investment and the anxieties that having a child provokes. It seems like we have reason to think that lifting those is not going to change people's reproductive decisions. That isn't to say that intensive parenting is not a problem we should seek to address in our whatever communities and collectively. It isn't to say that doesn't make parenting much harder. I think it does. But as a driver of the choice, it's hard for me to reconcile with what we basically have like a social experiment where we removed that aspect of parenting and it didn't seem to change people's decisions.
Well, there seems to be a related argument that people will make. So not that they're going to create these kids and put them into a world of suffering, but that they're going to create kids who are going to inflict suffering on the world, right? So, they're going to ruin the earth, right? They're going to put more demands on the earth and more demands on the world. And so nobody wants to feel responsible for that. I mean, are those complementary or are they in fundamental contradiction?
I mean, I think and I think both is really important because I think if you actually look at the way that climate change arguments are presented in, say, popular media and kind of middle highbrow conversation, you actually see the arguments mixed. So we go from the idea that it'll be in a terrible world to the idea that they are responsible for it, we are responsible for it, to talk of the notorious individual carbon footprint. And so I think they're complementary. And as I was saying, it's the suffering I think is made so much worse precisely because we are responsible for it. One of the kind of little thought experiments I always invite people to think about is to compare their attitudes towards an endangered species going extinct today to that of the many, many extinct species that went extinct, at least not under these circumstances. I mean, and think about ones that did changes that were not man-made at all. And as most people will report that somehow what's happening now, feels much, much worse. Why does it feel much, much worse? It's because we're responsible for it. Because it points to the possibility of anything from original sin in the theological register to a kind of just like innate evil in us. So I think they're complementary. I think, but I think we need to disentangle them and as I was saying, we're trying to help people think through this question clearly, one of the tools is actually to see and ask yourselves, like, what are people saying when they're saying because of climate change, you should not have children, because of the political situation, you should not have children. So we talked about suffering and what the kind of strategy for meeting it is. Maybe I'll say something about how to meet the strategy of evil. I think there's one kind of path, and it's really important in this context, which is actually to ask whether or not trying to aim at depopulation, encouraging the decline of birth rates would help the climate. And there's really tremendous work by two economists at UT Austin, Dean Spears and Mike Caruso, with whom I'm going to be collaborating in the future. And their book, Beyond the Spike, which is coming out really, really soon, makes a really compelling argument that, in fact, even if birth rates decline even further and fast, the kind of difference it would make to emission will be so gradual, and the kind of difference that the difference to emissions is going to make to the temperature is so negligible. The fantasy that depopulation is going to be a solution for climate change is just that. It's a fantasy. What we need is immediate global climate action, and nothing short of it would make a difference. They also really helpfully point out that, in fact, a rising population has been consistent with all sorts of kind of environmental improvements, including pollution, the quality of our waters, et cetera, et cetera. So, and again, I think some people would be maybe relieved to know that, but I think most people who are kind of raising that climate change concern might not be relieved. And I think it's because we need to address the greater anxiety again. And that's the anxiety that we are, in fact, nothing but these selfish, rapacious, kind of horrible creatures. And it's not worth reproducing us, not because we're going to suffer, but because what can it be a justification of bringing into our lives? And there's a bit of philosophical heavy lifting to do to show how the argument works there. But I'll say this, what we do is invite every reader to look at their own lives and ask themselves, is what they're worried about humanity writ large true of themselves? Is it the case that everything that they're pursuing because they're selfish, because they just happen to feel like doing it, or because it's promoting some kind of random goal that they have, which is to say, are they doing everything out of desire or instrumentally? I don't think that's true. I think all of us, in some one way or another, are doing things that I would say have absolute moral worth, which is to say, we're friends not just because we need some kind of social insurance policy. We do things simply because we think that is what a friend does. I think we, if it's in the pursuit of knowledge, it's in intellectual creations, if it's in our relation to art, we all have room in our own personal lives for something that has genuine ethical worth. I think from that perspective, we can see that it's precisely those projects of genuine ethical worth, political activism, the pursuit of justice, philosophy, knowledge, art, friendship. It's precisely those activities that in pursuing them, we see as worth pursuing into the future, not just by ourselves, not just for the duration of our natural lives, but collectively and sort of into that flourishing future. And I think from that perspective, we can realize that it's true. We have erred, we have failed, our achievements are very compromised, but it's not all darkness, which I think ultimately that raising of the argument from evil, that's what it points to. It's to this fear that we're just sort of completely rotten morally. But I think most of us individually don't think that of ourselves. And I think we can show in the book how that puts us in a position to realize that perhaps that's not true more broadly.
Well, I think most people who are considering becoming a parent, they're not thinking about these antinatalist arguments, right? For them, it's mostly about, it seems, figuring out what they, quote, really want, right? And so, I think people have this view that they have some preferences that are hardwired inside of them. And it's just about like discovering them or hoping that they somehow announce themselves, right? And you wake up one day and you're like, okay, that's it. I definitely want to be a parent, or I definitely don't want to be a parent. I mean, what does that say about, our view of how to live? Because, this would be a very curious thing, I think, for people in earlier times, and it seems like it's almost like an artifact of an economic way of thinking, right? Where it's not so much that you make choices about how to live based on ethical criteria or whatever. You kind of are trying to discover what it is that you want. I mean, is that a? I mean, is this something that is, I don't know, uniquely modern and Western?
I mean, I have to, I'll push back a little bit. I don't think that this is all that's going on. So I agree with you. Most people aren't articulating an explicit antinatalist concern. But I think I would be hard pressed to find somebody who wouldn't, when they were being asked about their ambivalence about having children, wouldn't kind of rattle off. And also the climate, and also look at the political situation, and also look at what's happening to reproductive rights. Also look at our look at the world we're living in. So first of all, I think that concern is in the background, but I think it's also in the background in the following way. I think the capacity that we had and that we lost to view life as essentially intergenerational, to think of human life as what the kind of thing, one of the things that can make it fulfilling and worth living is to engage with the past and do something to bring about a future, usually, as you were saying, not always, through becoming a biological parent. Part of what is being lost here, I think, is a kind of faith in the big human project. So while not everyone has the tools to philosophically articulate the challenge, I think it is, to quote Aristotle, maybe not on everyone's lips, but I think it is implicitly there. I think we see people choose things that, while economists say they are reducible to preferences, but that's because from a certain framework, everything a person chooses, you just call a preference. I think we see people do things that are quote unquote not in their best interest all the time. People sacrifice for quote unquote love and romantic relationships all the time. Romantic relationships take time. They make you have to make weird choices, like move to places you don't want to move to. They're financial burden. They restrain you, restrict you, and restrict your independence, all sorts of things. Most of us are not in a position to like seriously. It's complicated, but much less doubted than the project of children. Career, like you were saying, that can take enormous sacrifices from us, including especially as academics. So I think we see people who are still viewing some of the human, kind of basic human projects as ones that may justify a sacrifice, may justify a kind of cost, but it's uniquely children that are, we're sort of losing the ability to see them through that light. So I think these questions are not in the background, so to speak. And I can give some examples. So for instance, one thing we look at carefully is the rising literary genre of climate fiction, or eco-lit, as it's called. And if you look at that, it's a highly, highly popular genre of novels, and people are consuming them. And it's dozens of titles. They're not just being very popular and widely read, they're also getting a lot of critical acclaim. And the picture they're painting of humanity is not like the old apocalyptic novel. There are problems, but maybe there's a hero and maybe humanity could be redeemed and this is how we could do it. It's complete bleakness. So human beings are completely ineffectual. They're completely selfish. If any form of resistance is completely impotent. The only creatures that seem to be innocent of complete kind of moral degradation are like children, who will inevitably lose that as they become adults, and animals and trees and one story. So that's just one example, but I think this kind of worry, that philosophical humanistic worry, I think is broader than an economist would have the tools to see.
Well, in addition to eco-lit, you spend a lot of time talking about the motherhood ambiguity novel. There's like, I had no idea there were so many of them. I was familiar only with a few of them. But they all seem to, they all seem to make motherhood seem a bit scary, right? And I think they all seem to focus on the immediate transition from non-motherhood to motherhood, right? And emphasize, being a mother of an infant. It doesn't seem like they spend a lot of time discussing motherhood of, say, teenagers or adults. So what is it about this literature, and why is it so popular?
So the eco-lit novels, which we discussed in the context of thinking about the antinatalist arguments, and the motherhood ambivalence literature, which we discussed in the context of going to dedicate its own chapter to, they have something in common. Sometimes I like to think of it as a kind of courage of negativity, which is to say they have the courage of being of kind of truth telling and a kind of honesty. But I think it actually falls short of what ambivalence, at least traditionally in the psychoanalytic context in which it emerged, was. So ambivalence meant the capacity to hold negative and positive emotions towards the same object at one and the same time. For somebody like Melanie Klein, that's an accomplishment. In fact, it's a prerequisite of like maturity. So being able to do that. The inability to do that is called splitting. It's pathological. So the idea that the only attitude to take towards something that's failing us is one of complete despair and repulsion, say, that's a failure to be mature and grow up. Now, I think this is much more true of the eco-lit novel than the ambivalence literature. But I do think that one of the things that in some of the novels, and some of them are very good, but it's one of the things that we see is a kind of absence of, or let's say, kind of privileging of that negative pole of negativity versus others. Now, what we point out is not these novelists should, put on a smile and show us more about motherhood. I don't even think that it's right to say they show us too much about how motherhood is scary. It is really, really scary. The issue we take is that as they are approached, which is often as self-help, so women who are struggling with the question will approach it as self-help, which isn't the fault of the novelist. Maybe there's something in the way where, the readership's approaching it. They approach it as self-help for guidance. What they're getting is that one side, which is affirming the fear, and not just affirming the fear, but also affirming the kind of sophistication of a position of incredibly highly subjective, individualized, focusing on like what this experience means for me kind of approach. We contrast it with great works of literature. So we talk about Elena Ferrante, we talk about Tori Peters' Detransition Baby. So these are novels, contemporary novels, that actually do an amazing job of showing how motherhood is terrifying. They do an amazing job of showing how it's complex, but they also find room for affirming the in different ways what that experience can mean in the life of a human being. And I think that's really important to go through, especially for women. This one is for the ladies, so to say, because it could seem like if you're a certain kind of educated, intellectually, artistically, professionally creative woman, it could seem like the right position to take is one of this kind of one-sided ambivalence. And the other thing that you mentioned, and it's very true, is that there are different things that feed into this ambivalence. One of them is that the child is just an occasion of personal experience, to go back to this hedonic prediction and forecasting. So there's no question of the child becoming a full, mature human being in which you're entering into a relationship. And like one thing that makes that possible is that they're so squarely focused on either the decision to have children. So there's no child in the picture. And if there is one, it's that first year of life. And the first year of life is very significant. It's an important year of life, but it's not probably a good representative of what parenting is going to look like, which is an incredibly evolving experience. As we report, we've had people who reflected on their parenting. We asked them to talk about it, and they said, the most valuable and rewarding part of it has been having adult children, the kind of connection it gave me to the next generation that I would not have in my life. Or they talk about the different phases of having children. And it's just something that, as you're thinking about that, throwing yourself off a cliff, you're not seeing the world you'll be discovering once you make the jump. You're seeing really just that kind of steep drop.
Well, look, when we ask young people, what the what they view as the keys to a fulfilling life, they seem to prioritize work and job, and kids and family seem to be lower down on the list. I mean, is that something which is basically irreversible? I mean, is that going to be, the world that we're all going to live in going forward, or is there reason to be maybe suspicious of those survey results?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, both could be true at once. Prediction is that's not my field. As far as the general historical trends, I would say things are definitely going in a particular direction. Um, which is to say, it's hard to imagine things changing very radically. One thing that's important to note this is that it's not just that work and professional success is prioritized. Every other aspect in such service is prioritized over having children. So travel, having real estate, romantic fulfillment, friendship, political activism, absolutely everything when you conduct these surveys is being now prioritized over family. Um, as for the historical trend, yeah, that's a tough one. I hope that the work that we're doing and that others are doing is going to at least help people navigate both this terrain and ask themselves where they, not let themselves just be kind of one point in a data plot, and ask themselves what choices would be right for them and what role children will and will not play in their own individual lives.
Well, Anastasia, thank you so much for joining me. You are, in addition to being a philosopher and book author, you are, of course, a mother. So you know that of which you speak. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg, for having me.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.